Hi, Kirsten.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good.
I'll wait a few minutes here. We have, I think we have this is our fourth in our series, and we've had between 10 and 15 people at each of them. And I think we had 25 sign up. So
Wow, that's great.
hopefully they remember. I don't know if
Yeah.
this is midterm time or anything.
Yeah, fair enough.
How's your job going so far?
Pretty good. This was my first week, so just kind of
Oh,
easing into things and building up caseload and that sort of thing. But
where are you again?
so I'm living up in Port Elgin, which is
Right.
Lake
Yes.
Huron.
Yes. Yeah. Lovely area.
Yeah, it is.
What brings you there?
My mom actually moved here when I was away abroad
Oh,
at school,
oh,
so
okay. Yeah.
this is home for now.
Yes. Lovely. That's good. They have a clinic up that way then.
Yeah, exactly. There's actually quite a few in town because there's the big Bruce nuclear power plant here, so there's a ton of demand for it.
Right. Yes. Yes. I have a friend whose husband works for it. So
Okay, yeah.
they live in Owen Sound though.
Oh, yeah, we get quite a few people even in from Owen Sound, and we have a sister clinic in Owen Sound as well.
Yeah. And I could see it'd be kind of an underserviced area overall,
Yeah.
potentially hard to find staff.
Yeah. I think hard to retain people for sure.
Right. Yes. Yeah, like, well, similarly, some of our smaller clinics that way. If we have people who are born and raised in that area, and family they want to come home to or whatever, then that's one reason for them to come back, like after physio school, to that region, which is always nice because then they're local. Inevitably, they end up finding a partner who has a job like downtown Toronto or something like
Yeah.
that. So then they end up wanting to leave, or just because they're young and single and want to go out and have fun and stuff, they want to be in a larger metropolitan area, so they
Yeah. For
move
sure.
then. And then we often have young families kind of thing coming back that they have lived in downtown Toronto and now they have a baby or a toddler, and their kids are about to start school or something like that, and they're now looking for smaller communities again.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally understand that.
Yeah, lots of one more joining there, lots of reasons for where you want to be, where you want to be.
Yeah, definitely.
Hello. Okay, well, just because it's a few minutes after 7, I will start, and I'll try and let people in if I see them along the way. My name is Kristen. I am a registered physiotherapist at Aramosa Physiotherapy. I've been in physio for 23 years. I have really only worked at Aramosa Physio, I guess, since I first graduated, and I am a senior partner there. I did work as a registered kinesiologist for 3 years before I started, and been around in the business long enough to see lots of different models from a business standpoint as to what physios can be approached with when they start job searching. So that's what kind of my topic is today, and understanding the different models. They're all good in their own way, and they all have drawbacks in their own way. So from that perspective, it's really kind of understanding what they mean, and which is the hard part when you're a new grad and you don't have this experience, and knowing kind of the pros and cons to it, so you can kind of choose the one that fits best with what you need as a new person working kind of thing, and your own situation. And hopefully I'll be able to explain some of those along the way. I'll let you know this is the fourth of our student success series, and we do have one other that we are just starting to market in case either of you happen to be interested or you have classmates that may be interested. That is called The Day in the Life of a Pelvic Health Physiotherapist, with Ashley Masters, one of my colleagues, and it will occur on Thursday, April 13th, again from 7 to 8:30. So we will be starting to send out that information to the various schools and social media wise and stuff. And it's on our website in our education section. So you are welcome to register for free if you are interested in learning a little bit more about that, should pelvic health be of interest to you. And my slide is not advancing. What is going on here? So first of all, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today I thought I would talk about different types of employment models. So the employee versus a contractor or somebody who's self-employed, some of the pros and cons of these different type of compensation models, types of remuneration, the working environments and cultures that can be affected by the method of payment that way, things to consider from a patient profile perspective and the flow of the clinic, the use of assistants, as I mentioned, kind of the cultures that are based on the compensation models, a little bit about professional development, and some tips with regards to job hunting and interviewing. So first of all, we'll talk about being self-employed or an independent contractor. So this tends to be an approach for smaller private clinics kind of thing, versus like you won't see it in a hospital typically, unless it might be like a short-term basis in a hospital where the hospital only wants to hire somebody for like a 3-month period or something like that. Then they may have kind of a contractor that way. But typically it is used for private clinics more commonly. So good when you are interviewing somewhere to find out this status of how you would be hired. And one suggestion that they may offer, or one way they may offer you employment, is being an independent contractor. So as someone new to the world of physiotherapy from that perspective, it's good for you to know that the existence of a contract that's saying that you, as the worker, is self-employed isn't sufficient to establish employment status with the an employer or the payer, whoever's paying you, according to the CRA. So it definitely is good if, well, in any case, whether it's an employee or a self-employed person, if they're giving you a contract, in any case, you should always get a lawyer to have a look at it just so you understand all the details about it. But certainly understand as well that just because you have a contract that says you're self-employed doesn't mean you actually are self-employed. And there's various terms and conditions of employment that have to be determined from the CRA's perspective to see if you meet self-employed status. So from that perspective, you have to, as a self-employed person, maintain your own business profile, and there's a variety of criteria that way. So for example, you would have to identify that you are able to set your own hours kind of thing. That's one of the criteria to be identified as self-employed. For example, you have to rent or lease space as well. Just letting somebody else into the chat here. There we go. So you have to potentially rent or lease space, which means that you have to invoice the employer as to whatever your set amount is for renting the space. That's typically a flat monthly rate that you would pay for the space that you're using. That may also either, you would have to provide all your own equipment. So, you'd have to have your own reflex hammers or, mobilizations belts or whatever type of physio you're doing, whatever type of equipment you had, models, things like that. Or if you were going to use what the employer had, then you would have to lease it from them. So that would have to be on your invoice that you give them once a month. And then they would pay you based on how you have set up the payment kind of thing for your services. So they would give you a fee and you would give them a fee that way to be kind of considered fully self-employed. There is a variety of different types of things that have to be considered. by being self-employed. And ultimately, the CRA or a court will consider a number of different factors to determine your employment status. So, for example, the level of control of your as the worker's activities. So, kind of, can you choose your days and times that you have to work, or are you working only in times that the employer has available to you because of other employees? As I say, the ownership of your tools or equipment, the authority to hire helpers or subcontracts. So for example, if I was self-employed and I, let's say, was going on a maternity leave, or let's say I wanted to take a leave of absence to go travel the world for 6 months, because I have a contract with the employer, I would have to be able to continue to provide those services. So if I was not going to be there to provide those services, I would have to meet my contract, hire somebody else to be able to provide those services on my behalf if I wasn't there. The degree of responsibility for investment and management held by the worker. So again, if I was self-employed, I would have to potentially invest in other tools or equipment that I need to be able to do my job. And along the same lines, the opportunity for profit and loss, in that I have to take risks kind of thing to be able to, let's say I'm thinking that I would like to be able to provide shockwave kind of thing as a service. So that's a machine I have to buy or lease kind of thing to be able to provide that service. But if I don't have enough patients that are interested in having shockwave, then technically I could take a personal financial loss kind of thing on that service because I have invested in paying for a shockwave and it didn't turn out. So those are some of the kind of risk factors that the CRA wants to be able to see if you're considering yourself to be self-employed. There are some of the pros and cons kind of with regards to being self-employed. As the pros, there's definitely the potential for higher profit or income, and you can set your own rates kind of thing. So you could set higher hourly rates or percentages, and typically as a self-employed person, because you don't tend to have additional benefits given to you as a self-employed person, you typically do, as an hourly rate, have a higher wage than somebody who was employed. A pro, though, as well, though, is that you have the flexibility of setting your own hours and your own schedule. You have control over your own workload and volume. So if you find you're too busy, you can give yourself a break, kind of thing. Or you could slow things down, or you could choose how long you're going to spend with someone. You know, if the rest of the clinic typically sees people for 20 minutes, you could choose to do 30 if you wanted to. You can set your own fees to your clients that way, and ultimately you're your own boss. Some of the cons is that because you may have to buy your own equipment or rent it kind of thing, there is the risk that you could have a financial loss that way. As well, income could be inconsistent depending on whether your schedule was full or not that way. Being self-employed, you aren't eligible for any stat holiday pay or vacation pay. So whenever you're not working, you're not making any money. There is not allowed to be, according to the CRA, any integration with staff, employees, or colleagues. So basically, you can't do social things with the other staff. So, for example, if your employer was setting up a Christmas party for everybody else on who are employees, and you were self-employed with them and a contractor, theoretically, you should not be going to that Christmas party, because CRA would then see you as a staff member versus an independent contractor. There wouldn't be other health benefits like extended healthcare benefits or education allowances. There is an increased accountability at tax time as well. You would have to be able to show all of the expenses that you had, and kind of prove that they're expenses, and so there's more for you to do from a tax perspective. Also good to know that there is either no unemployment insurance, or you can now, just prior to COVID, luckily, they have EI has now allowed you to register for self-employed EI, but you have to calculate your own and pay your own premiums and submit all your supporting documentation, versus if you're an employee, that's all done for you. So if EI would be, for example, if you wanted to take a maternity leave and you thought you would like to have some money coming in and be able to claim EI, then you would have to either register yourself beforehand or you wouldn't be eligible for it, basically. As I say, you have to meet all the criteria from the CRA to be self-employed. Otherwise, they could reverse your status that way, and there could be significant financial repercussions because of that. Versus being an employee, which tends to be the most common relationship between an employer and employee, and it's kind of very well understood and very straightforward. Ultimately, the employee is on the payroll of the employers, and the employer has all the taxes going to the government removed or deducted at the source. So basically, the paycheck that you get is the paycheck that you get, and all of those taxes have been paid for you, so you don't have to worry as much at tax time. Typically, compensation tends to be either by salary or by hour, but this could be different depending on the environment, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, where it could be per patient, a percentage, or what's called a fee for service. And typically, as an employee, there's often a probationary period, which is standardly kind of 3 months, so that you can choose to leave in that first 3-month period if you decide, yep, this is just not the right fit for me, I'm not enjoying it here. Or your employer could do the same thing, that they say, you know what, this just isn't working out in those first 3 months. After the 3-month period, then if there's benefits that are available to you, then those tend to kick in, and then you are officially considered an employee of that organization. So it is good in either case, as a self-employed person or an self-employed or an employee person, to understand a bit of the Employment Standards Act. So this covers basically all workers in Ontario. However, interestingly, there are sections for professional people, which do include physiotherapists, that do make us exempt from certain things. So not that physios would ever have to worry about making minimum wage kind of thing. They tend to be well above that. However, we are exempt from making minimum wage, interestingly. There also is no daily or weekly limits to our hours of work. So versus with the regular Employment Standard Act, if, for example, if 40 hours is considered full-time, and if you're working over 44 hours, then you would get have to be paid kind of time and a half and so on. That does not exist for physiotherapists. Similarly, your employer does not have to give you daily rest or daily eating periods. Many do, but they're not required to. They're also not required to give you any time off between shifts. So for example, if you, let's say your clinic closed at 9 o'clock at night or something like that, and you had to start work the next morning at 7 a.m., you could do that kind of thing. Similarly, if you're at a hospital and you're working 12-hour shifts, you could have multiple 12-hour shifts all in a row kind of idea, that we are exempt from being given a certain amount of time off between shifts that way. As I mentioned, overtime pay. So if they're working more than 44 hours, you're still not exempt. You're still not eligible for overtime pay. Sick leave. If you aren't allowed sick leave according to the ESA, if leaving would be a professional misconduct, so meaning that you would not be able to provide care to people that needed it, being that there was nobody that you could kind of replace yourself with, kind of thing. And you are exempt from vacation with pay, interestingly. Now, these things are, as I say, they're all in the labor laws, employment standard acts, if you wanted to look them up that way, and specifically physiotherapists, including other professionals. There are a number of different professionals, pharmacists, psychiatrists that all fall into this, and I think mushroom farmers. I don't know why that is, but anyways, they all fall into this kind of exemption that way. Now, knowing that this exists, there are lots of employers that do provide these things for you. It's just good for people, physios, to know if you happen to be interviewing at a place and they say, oh, by the way, we don't, even if you're an employee, so you might expect vacation pay, the clinic may not choose to offer it to you. It would be considered a benefit if they did. So good to be aware of that so that you're not shocked if they happen to say that to you. So as I mentioned, often physiotherapists do have benefits. So statutory holiday pay, vacation pay are often covered. Sick leaves are often covered, leave of absences, and employment insurance like EI. So for example, if you were going on a maternity leave or something like that, you are often covered at minimum just for the time off. Like if you wanted to take this 6 months or a year, or now potentially a year and a half for maternity leave, you could do that. Some employers will have top-ups available to you. Those tend to be the larger institutional type employers like hospitals. They may do some top-up of your EI while you're off on a maternity leave. Many private clinics wouldn't be able to do that, but at least they would guarantee your job when you came back. Also, other benefits might include educational allowances, medical, dental, health, and or life or disability insurance, and various types of training and mentoring as benefits. So being an employee, some of the pros are that there typically is offered vacation and stat holiday pay. It tends to be very reliable compensation that way. You're often offered education allowances. You may have extended healthcare benefits. You may have pensions, RRSP options. You are protected as an employee under the ESA laws that way. So the employer couldn't fire you from a discriminatory perspective kind of thing. In generally, being an employee is considered more stable. There's no financial risk as an employee versus an independent contractor, and the taxes are considerably simpler. Some of the cons is that you are an employee, so you are not your own boss. So as a result, your employer sets up your work hours, days, duties, etc., and they tend to be less flexible. They'll say, guess what, you work Monday to Friday or whatever, and your hours are X to Y. And if you wanted them to be A to B, they may or may not be able to allow that to occur. You would have a lack of control from the perspective that you have to follow your employees' policies and processes. Think of high school. They had dress codes, things like that you would have to follow, kind of thing. And they may have certain kind of, restrict the way that you want to self-express. They may not like piercings. They may want tattoos covered. They may not want purple hair, things like that. There is always the risk that you happen to be hired by a company that doesn't have very good management. So from that perspective, the business may not be run very well. So that could cause instability. So again, if you're interviewing, it might always be good to have an idea as to how long has this company been around, right? If it's a newer company, it's maybe a little more risky from the perspective that you don't really know how the management would do in a difficult time. Like even just thinking of COVID over the last few years, there definitely were a lot of clinics that closed, and those were ones that were probably struggling well before COVID, and COVID basically, teetered them over the edge kind of thing that way. And there's possibly limited development opportunities. So for example, like in a larger kind of more institutional type of places and even smaller clinics, there may be limited abilities for you to move upwardly should you be interested in becoming a manager of some sort. There's lots of different pay methods that can be offered to both employees and self-employed contractors, and they really vary more on the workplace versus whether it's employee or self-employed. So salary is obviously an X amount. They may say, guess what, we're going to hire you at 65,000 or 70,000 or whatever it is over the year. And they basically divide that up over the year so that you get a regular amount all pay periods. So it's very steady that way. You know exactly what you're getting every pay period. Kind of one con to that may be that you maybe having to work a lot harder at certain times of year when it's busy or something like that, but you are still making the same amount of money. The kind of benefit or a pro that way is that if you have debt to pay, then you know you're making the same amount of money kind of thing. So you know that you can apply to your debt that way whenever you need to, because you know your paycheck's staying the same. An hourly rate is obviously based on the hours that you're working. They typically are the beginning of your day to the end of your day. So if your hours can be quite steady if you're at a steady clinic. If it's a brand new clinic or something that isn't very well established, your hours may go up and down a lot depending on how many new patients they have or they can fill your schedule with. But the benefit to an hourly rate is that if, let's say, you're supposed to start at noon and work until 7 p.m. or something like that, and your noon person is there and your next person's there, and then your next 2 hours worth of patients falls apart because there's a snowstorm, and yet you're still working through until later in the day, you're still paid for all of those hours in between when you're not doing anything and there's no patients to treat. Some hourly rates include what are called an all-in hourly rate. So that's always good to ask if they are offering you an hourly rate as to what does that include? Is that just for work, or is it including any other benefits? Sometimes they'll include your vacation pay in that time, or any sick pay or stat holiday pay they'll include in that hourly rate. So it's good to know what your hourly rate consists of. That way, if you're being offered something with an hourly rate. Being paid percentage or per patient or fee for service. So this is based on, well, the first two, percentages and per patient, are a set amount based on what revenues the patient is giving the clinic. So for example, if it is a private patient, for round numbers, let's just say their assessment is $100 and their treatments are $50 or something like that. So a percentage would be, typically for a new grad, maybe 40%, something like that. Typically, as it gets experience, it goes up to about 50%. Rarely do you have percentages that go higher than 50%. And if they are higher than 50%, it's often a more questionable type of environment where it may not be physiotherapist owned and operated, and you may be seeing a lot more patients, for example, or there's other things being billed under your name. So that's good to kind of consider that way. But ultimately, let's say it's a good clinic and you're making 40% kind of thing. So 40% of the $100 assessment is $40. Of your $50 treatment is $20. If the patient doesn't show, it's $0, right? So that's kind of the risk that way, is that if your patient doesn't show, you don't make anything. That's the same as the per patient. The per patient may be based on, again, the type of patient, and this would affect the percentage as well, in that there are different types of payments through different types of patients. So private patients tend to pay a flat rate that is agreed upon, that the clinic puts a notification up for and stuff. But WSIB, for example, has mandated rates, and so does the auto industry. So those ones are fees that an employer cannot change, so for example, the WSIB has what's called a program of care, in which case you're paid a block billing, which, don't quote me exactly, but let's say the first 4 weeks that you see the person, you get paid, let's say, $500. And that doesn't matter whether you're seeing them 5 times or 15 times, which obviously if you're seeing them more, you get paid less per visit kind of thing. So there's different things to kind of consider that way. Similarly, the fee for service is for doing a certain service. So for WSIB or MVA, the WSIB fee for service, I believe, is like $26-ish right now, and a few cents or something like that. Well, for an auto insurance person is $99.75. So those, if you were making a percentage of those, then it depends on who you're seeing. If you, as a new therapist, are getting all the WSIB patients, you may not make very much at all. But if you happen to be making at a clinic that sees a lot of MVA patients, you may make quite a bit as a percentage that way. So good to consider if they are offering these types of different pay ways to pay, as to what population are you going to see. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. This is a compensation survey that the OPA and CPA do every 4 years typically. I think they did one out in the community to get the survey information back in the fall, but it hasn't been posted yet. So this is the most recent one that I could find. So they looked at a pile of members. This is all just in Ontario. The different provinces through CPA do it all for their own. But this basically looks at kind of the most commonly earned salary by sector for full-time. So everything is calculated based on if you were working full-time versus a part-time. So full-time physiotherapist practicing 5 years or less. So for people who were working in the hospitals, they determined that there was an equal number of respondents that were earning between 60 and basically 70,000 and between 70 and 80,000. So it did take quite a while, 16 years to be of work experience to be able to make more than 80,000 that way. In private practice, they divided it a little bit differently, and basically said the most common one was the 60 to 70,000. Over 70,000 were physios that had more experience that way. And they also had what they called primary care. So this is the most common kind of title, I guess, used in private practice. So it basically means as a primary care physiotherapist that you have patients coming to you for general things that you would then be screening, kind of like a GP, basically, you know, without a referral, that you could see whoever's coming in the door, basically, which is a lot of private practices that way, versus that in the hospital you may only see, you know, fracture patients, or you may only see stroke patients or something like that. So we're not in a primary care treating a pathology, you're treating general populations that way. And in that case, that the most common subset was between 70 and 79 or 80,000. So basically it's pretty similar kind of thing in both hospital, and you're going to probably, whether you're starting in hospital or starting in private practice, depending on what city you're in and the environment and so on, you'll be making somewhere between 60 and 80,000. There was not very good response rate on this sector or survey related to long-term care and home care. So the survey is available on the OPA website, so I didn't go into that. It was more complicated to explain. This is the breakdown for compensation in private practice as to the hourly rate being about 31%, a percentage kind of thing based model at 21%, amount per client or per visit, again, 29%, so pretty close to the hourly rate versus an annual salary. So this would be different in a hospital situation. It tends to be, for example, a much higher on a salary side and much less on the other sides that way. Similarly, in larger organizations, like if you're working in an insurance company or a university setting or something like that, that would be more similar to a hospital. And these are the annual salaries. This is getting older now. At 2018 in private practice is the top one here. And ultimately, if you kind of look at the graphs between the top being the private practice and the bottom being the hospital, although you may start slightly higher at a hospital, the you will move up faster in private practice, and there are more people making more than 90,000 in private practice than there are in hospitals. So again, kind of depends on, what you're looking for when you're, if money is even an issue for you, maybe it's more the environment and the population that you're interested in. But if you're considering money only, then if you need money ASAP when you graduate, a hospital job's probably better to start you off at. But if you want more money on a long term and you want the ability to make more, then private practice would be better from that perspective if you're only considering money. But of course, it's better to consider the working environments as well. So obviously, you've probably learned from your placements, there's lots of different environments that physios can work in, hospitals and institutions, and those institutions could be universities, governments, insurance companies, etc. There's home care, there's various industries that have healthcare practitioners on site, and then there's a variety of different types of private practice. Good to consider from a private practice perspective if you're interviewing there to learn who owns it, because the philosophies behind how the practice runs tend to be dependent on who owns it. I'm always a big proponent of physiotherapists owning practices versus doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs kind of thing, just because from that perspective, physiotherapists, we know what we do and we do best and so on. So we understand better the time you need to be able to do these things well, versus if you had a lawyer-owned clinic or an orthopedic surgeon who owned the clinic. They may insist that you follow the same kind of model that they do, where they may see patients every 3 to 5 minutes kind of thing, and they don't understand why you want longer than that, basically. And private practices, of course, can have physios work kind of in sporting communities, on teams and so on. Obviously, there's a variety of different populations that are served, that it can be general populations, pediatrics, geriatric, sports, or be condition specific. So musculoskeletal or orthopedics, women or men's health, neurological, with a variety of different types of neurological conditions, and cardiovascular, again, quite a variety that way. In any working environment, it's good to have an idea of how many patients you'd see, just to get an idea of the flow of your day. So this is an even older compensation survey done by the OPA, and they didn't re-ask this question in the 2018 survey, so I don't have updated numbers on that. But back in 2006, which is getting quite old now, but they had it broken down as to how many patients you'd see on average per day. So they basically said non-OHIP employees, so this would be in private practice, so physios that don't have OHIP coverage in that employment environment, they would typically see between 15 and 30 patients a day, versus a self-employed contractor would tend to see a little bit more at 15 to 35. And OHIP employees, so that's a physiotherapist that may be working in private practice, but at a clinic that has OHIP billing privileges. Now, that hasn't existed since 1968 in Ontario, when OHIP stopped giving out additional OHIP billing privileges to clinics, but there are clinics around that still do have OHIP billing licenses, and they tend to, because again, OHIP mandates the amount per patient that you can bill. And I honestly don't know what it is. I know for chiropractors, I think it was about $14, because one of my friends is chiro and he said that. So I think physio is about the same. So considering that you can only bill so little, they tend to see a much higher volume of patients and have more physio aides do the actual work, and have physiotherapists kind of supervise them that way. And then I just put down an example of our own clinic there, that depending on how many hours you work, our physios tend to see somewhere between 13 and 18 patients a day. So again, common practices. Common is kind of in Ontario, 3 patients an hour. You'll see some clinics where there's 2 patients an hour as like a 30-minute patients, or ones that have 4 or more an hour that way. We do 3 an hour, and we know based on our schedules and how we try to keep them moving and free, that we typically will have an average throughout the day of 2 to 3 patients a day, kind of thing that way. Or sorry, 2 to 3 patients an hour. And that's because of blocks or holes or no-shows or cancellations or spots that never got filled within the day. As I mentioned earlier, there's a variety of ways that patients can pay for services, and that can affect the population and the environment that you work with, and the population that you see and the environment that you work with as well. So as I mentioned, OHIP sites would be hospitals and sites with OHIP billing licenses that still exist. Private clinics tend to have a lot of extended healthcare insurance. Private clinics can have patients that don't have extended health care but pay what we call out of pocket. So they're paying privately themselves for every time they come. And then there's a lot of third-party payers. So for example, the Workers' Compensation Board or Safety Insurance Board and MVA companies or motor vehicle accident companies. And then there's sometimes different employers that would have kind of certain benefits for their employees that will bill directly as a third-party payer that way. Typically with these third-party payers, there's additional charting and additional paperwork considerations. So many of them pay slightly better. WSIB does not, but they do require additional paperwork considerations that way. So if you're interviewing with a place, it's always also good to get an idea of the kind of breakdown of their patient profile as to who tends to attend that clinic, because it'll give you an idea of kind of the extras that you may have to be involved in. So for example, I put down for our clinics, we tend to have about 75% to 80% being private patients. Roughly 15 to 20% is WSIB, and we're also a WSIB specialty clinic, so that's why I have them kind of together, and about 5% automobile insurance-wise. So as I say, that's a good question to ask places that you're interviewing. Ultimately, the two different, whether you're choosing to be an employee or an employer, self-employed person, there's pros and cons, as I say, to both, and you ultimately want to kind of figure out the way that's going to be best for you, knowing that there's pros and cons to both, kind of thing, as I say that way. Thinking of kind of professional development, obviously, if you're graduating, there is kind of a supervised practice component or provisional practice period when you first start. So it's good to have an idea of what would be offered to you that way. Some places just have what I kind of call the sink or swim environment, where you have a supervisor who theoretically signs everything off with the college and so on, but may or may not be on site and may or may not be able to meet with you regularly, and just kind of is a resource for you should something go wrong, but isn't necessarily there to help promote and develop you, kind of thing. And then there are lots of places that have more formal mentoring, which may include some of the following. So it's good to ask as to who your mentor would be, kind of thing, and what kind of experience they may have, whether you are a sole practitioner in a clinic, or whether there's other colleagues around that you could ask questions to. With your direct supervisor, what would be kind of the format for mentoring, as to would they meet with you on a regular basis for a period of time? Would they give you feedback at various times, kind of thing? Are there any in-services or trainings for new graduates? Are there any rounds or any other kind of methods of learning things from some of your colleagues? Are there additional mentoring for example, if you're interested in going into the orthopedic division level system, which is now called the AIM system, there is additional mentoring hours that are required should you be interested in going on to do your intermediate or advanced exams, or for sport physiotherapy certification. So does the clinic have someone who can mentor for those things? Not that you would necessarily, not that you'd want to do it necessarily your first week or two of working, but if you're there with the clinic over the next couple of years, it's nice to have an idea whether they would help meet your needs that way. Is an education allowance available? And also nice to know, if you take courses, are there specific ones that are recognized at performance reviews? Like, do they just let you take anything and everything of your interest, or are there ones specifically that they promote based on the type of population that they see in the clinic? And if you're taking courses, can you move up the pay scale faster because of that? Is the clinic actively involved in research and knowledge transfer? That's one thing I know I had a bit of a culture shock too when I first graduated, because I was so used to having access to, well, in those days, the library kind of thing. And it was a lot harder to get articles and research and so on, because Google wasn't as good as it is now, and so on. So when I first graduated and started working, I didn't have access to research that I was looking for that was up to date. So some schools now, upon graduation, allow you to continue to have access online to their library. Some of the schools cut your library access within a couple months of you graduating that way. So it's nice to know, is there other ways that you can get some of that information? And as your clinics or environments involved in teaching and education and hosting courses. Um, Also good to have an idea as to whether you are part of a team, whether that is of independent contractors or of employees. So do you have colleagues versus if you're in a sole practice? So often a lot of smaller clinics or more rural clinics will be more sole practice, and or there may be portions of a day that you are alone, which is perfectly fine. But you want to know what your options are, kind of thing, that way, should you have a question. Like if it's 8 o'clock at night and you're doing a new assessment and you're all alone in the clinic, and the assessment is identifying concerns that is raising kind of your spider senses, what can you do if that's the case, kind of thing, versus if you have colleagues that you can bounce ideas off of. The use of assistance. So there is a competency checklist that is available through our college, and I did put the link here, and it's also on a resource page at the end of the presentation that way as well. So definitely, if you're working in an environment that has assistants, those assistants could be officially registered PTAs. They could be people that have just been working as assistants for long periods of time. They could be volunteers, that may be high school students who just want to see what physio is all about, kind of thing. Or they could be people who have graduated with kinesiology who are not registered kinesiologists yet, or who are registered kinesiologists. In any case, it's good to know who the people are, what their backgrounds are, what their education and their training is. Know that you are reviewing kind of their role and their responsibility with you and the patient. Ensure that they have adequate training for what you are providing that way. And you may need to provide some of that education and training. You have to watch the provision of their care, and basically know their qualifications that they are able to provide that care. And then you also have to consider the environment that you're in as to how charting and communication will occur. If you're, for example, in a home care setting and you're going to one place and your assistant's going to another place, how would you communicate should the assistant find that there was a problem there? Or if the assistant is providing care to a clinic, to a patient in your clinic, but you happen to be off that afternoon, how would you communicate if there was an issue? How are things billed? So are they being billed as physiotherapy under your name? Or is it, if they're, for example, if they're a registered kinesiologist, does that change the billing that way at all? And are they familiar with, various things that you might be doing, such as using hot packs or ultrasounds or IFC machines, and familiar with exercises that tend to be your favorites that way? And ultimately consider whether it's going to be a benefit to having a patient, to your patient, to have someone else do some of the care for you that way. Job searching, when you're starting to look for jobs, always good to kind of reflect a little bit yourself as to what kind of patient populations have you worked with. or what kind of cultures have you noticed on placement that you've enjoyed? Always, kind of reflect back as to how many placements you've had, if it's been 4 or 5 at this point, which ones were your favorite and why? Was it because you liked the population? Was it because you liked the type of pathologies that you were treating? Was it the environment that you worked in? The people seemed really friendly. There was a good positive vibe about it. There were lots of fun things from a social perspective. Why were people happy if, if that was the case? And are those things valuable to you that way? Think about the location of the sites that you're considering versus your home. Lots of new grads are happy to get a job, I think, from that perspective, and they don't necessarily stop to think, where do they want to be in a few years? So they may take a job that they think is a great fit for them, but then as time goes on, they get tired of commuting, and or the expense of gas goes up, which has for the last few years, obviously, too, and or they have a significant other who is in a different place that if they end up going on with their relationships, that maybe from that perspective that they end up wanting to relocate again, and in which case they may be starting building their caseload from scratch again. So good to kind of consider about where you are currently living or where you plan to live, and try and find places close to where you want to be from that perspective. Think about other opportunities that you've had that way, skills that you've developed or learned that way on your placements, if those are skills that you'd like to continue to work on. Refer to what you've worked on for any special projects that you did in school. Was there anything in school or on your placements that you had to learn or work on that were really inspiring to you that way, that may help give you guidance as to what type of place or what type of population or conditions you're interested in that way? Um, Prior to physio school, you may have other experience. Maybe you worked as a PTA or a kinesiologist or something like that, or maybe you volunteered at a hospital or a sports team, and think about what things that gave you, especially thinking if it gave you good communication skills. And these are some of the things that you can then also pass on during your interviews. Also good to identify when you are in an interview, any related courses you have, and think about kind of what your future goals are as a physio that way. Some of the kind of interviewing tidbits. I've done a ton of interviews over my 23 years. And I'm always impressed when somebody knows who our company is. So wherever you are interviewing, make sure you research the company. So go on the websites, look up their websites, look at what services they offer, see if there's programs that are special or unique to that company. Look down some of the staff as to who, if they have staff listed, read some of their bios to get an idea of what the things that are special about them, kind of thing that way. And so on. Look at Google reviews as well. So you get an idea from a patient's perspective, knowing that we can't please everyone all the time. There's, there's just some, people spreading hate sometimes that way. So take them with a grain of salt. But if you're consistently finding that there are lots of good reviews, then that's probably a good thing. Just like if you're buying something and there's lots of good reviews on them, or you're going on a holiday and there's lots of good reviews about the hotel you're going to. Be prepared to answer clinical questions. So typically in an interview, I will always ask a clinical question that way. Not that there's necessarily a right or wrong answer to the clinical question, but more just because the employer is often looking for kind of your thought process to get an idea of your philosophy of treatment, and does that jive with what the institutions is, kind of thing. So ours at our clinic, for example, we always say that we have kind of 3 pillars for treatment with regards to providing education, exercise, and manual therapy that way. So if somebody liked to do a lot of kind of passive modalities, we do have some passive modalities, but it's not something that we, focus on. So if that was something that somebody was absolutely passionate about doing, then maybe they don't fit with us, kind of thing that way. Always good to dress professionally and come with a positive attitude. think of your 5-year plan kind of thing, which is often hard to do, but start to think as to, would you consider going back to school and doing like a research master's or a PhD, or maybe there's something else in some form of management or public health or who knows what that you might be interested in. So have an idea if there's future schooling that you're interested in. Is there a future population that you're thinking of going into? Are there courses? So I mentioned the AIM program kind of thing that way. Is that something that you're interested in doing? Or is there a subset of physiotherapy? Maybe you're interested in women's health and you don't want to do it now, but 2 or 3 years down the road, you'd like to maybe go into looking at women's health or concussion management or something like that. You may already have an idea as to what your dream job would be. And that's often a question that I will ask my interviewees, from the perspective that as an employer, we always like to try and be that person's dream job. So, I have had therapists that have said, I'm wanting to work in orthopedics because I feel like it's a great way to get my musculoskeletal skills up to par. And I know that's going to be with the general population. But in the future, I really like kids. I'd like to do something with kids. And we'd say, great, kind of thing. Thanks for telling us that. And then as they gain their experience and so on, we keep that in our kind of back pocket of knowing that they're interested in working with kids. So we have had therapists that then we have then created, a pediatric caseload for, because we know they are interested in that population. Or another one was that I had a fairly young grad physio who had a partner who developed juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And so she saw that he suffered with these flares of rheumatoid arthritis, and she was keen on learning more about rheumatological conditions and so on. So there we started developing as to, is that something that we could start as a patient population, something that we could market towards, so that you're then treating the type of people that you really want to be, but stay within the organization. Some companies will be able to do this, some of them won't, because it won't kind of fit their overall mandate or the populations that they're looking for. But it's good to know if that company would jive with what you wanted to do from that perspective. Ask about maybe culture of the company. Are there staff social activities and so on? That may or may not be important to you, but that's just a suggestion that way. Maybe you want to be able to show up at work and just do your work and turn around and leave and have your own social life and not have your worlds collide kind of thing that way. Well, other people do like to meet friends and have more of a social component at work that way. And then whenever you're done the interview, I always appreciate as an employer as well, that whenever I get a follow-up interview or follow-up email from the interviewee, not necessarily within the hour kind of thing, but a day or two later, it's always nice to get a thank you that, hopefully, especially if they were keen on the job, kind of thing that way, to identify that they feel that they are a good fit and why they're a good fit, because it helps to reinforce their positive skills that way, especially if an interviewer or an employer is doing a lot of interviews. If you happen to be the first person they interview, then they may say, wow, that person X was an excellent candidate, but I've got all these other candidates I have to do, and the appointments are already scheduled. So by the time they've done the third or fourth or maybe fifth interview, they've kind of forgotten a little bit of why you might have shined as the first person. So if they then get an email from you kind of pointing out all those things, they go, oh yeah, she was a really good fit. That, he or she was I think going to be the best candidate of them that way. So it again shows your follow through, shows that you're connected, interested, keen, etc. that way, and helps to remind your employer some of the benefits of hiring you. A little bit about EPA kind of thing as a summary of our benefits. We offer or we schedule hour-long assessments and 3 patients per hour. We do pay on an hourly rate as an employee, and we do pay for vacation and stat holidays and what we call an all-in rate. We have a flex benefit package for the first 3 years with us, which includes education allowance and a medical allowance that you can split in whatever percentage you want, kind of thing. If you want to take a lot of courses, it could be 100% all education. If you know you've got a massive dental bill, it could be all medical, kind of thing. And then after working for 3 years with us, you get a formal extended health care plan plus an education allowance. And then you have a future option of a pension that EPA can put money into, and you can put additional money into if you want. We also do provide life insurance and fitness benefits. We have staff socials, a variety of different types of things, Christmas parties, golf, movies, etc., and a variety of professional development. So we have a very formalized provisional practice or supervised practice session or period until you graduate, until you become registered. We have what we call rounds in a variety of different ways for physios who are interested in pelvic health or orthopedics. We offer advanced mentoring through all of the AIMS system. We have in-house course opportunities, a variety of exposures to different types of populations. So should you be interested in sports or pediatrics or pelvic health, concussion type things like that. And that because we are called Aramosa Physiotherapy Associates, we are true to our name from an associate's perspective, and that we have what we call an associate model, which allows for career development and upward mobility, so that you're not necessarily just being a staff physio. You certainly can be a staff physio forever if you want to be, kind of thing, but should you want to be doing other things or becoming an expert in a certain way or becoming a manager or an owner or a director, things like that, there's options for all of that. And then online, if you haven't found these things already, there are great resources through both the CPA and OPA. So this the new grad toolkit, which has a lot of great information in it, including a lot of the information that I gathered for this presentation for. So I got the job, what's next, some of the interviewing tips that I put there, and then whether you're looking at a contractor or employee, then this is a number of good sites that way, and that does include all of the kind of information that way, including the Canada Benefits one as to whether you can be registered to be self-employed that way for EI. You're welcome to take a screenshot of that if you'd like. And then that's the end of my kind of official format that way. Are there any questions? And I just am kind of getting out of my screen here and so on, so I can see. Kirsten, I think you have your hand up there.
Yeah, I do. I don't have any questions. Just wanted to say thank you for doing this.
Oh, good. Well, hopefully it was helpful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you very much for attending. And yeah, as I say, if you're I don't know if you're interested in pelvic health or not, but there'll be another little talk on Thursday, April 13th, should you be interested in that. Thanks.